In 2007, the United States Army faced a crisis it could not solve with American engineering alone. Improvised explosive devices in Iraq and Afghanistan were killing and maiming soldiers at a rate that was becoming politically and militarily unsustainable. The Pentagon launched the largest emergency vehicle acquisition program in modern military history, the Mine-Resistant Ambush Protected Vehicle Program, eventually spending over $45 billion on more than 27,000 vehicles. The program is well documented. The Max Pro, the Cougar, the Buffalo. What is less well known is that one of the most successful vehicles in that entire American program was not American at all. It was South African. Developed a decade earlier, refined through real combat in a war most Americans had never heard of, and purchased by the United States in quantities that made it one of the most numerous mine-protected vehicles in the entire coalition inventory. The vehicle was the RG-31 Nyala. To understand why South Africa had a combat-proven mine-protected vehicle ready for American purchase in 2007, you need to go back to the same source as every other vehicle in this story. The V-hull principle, proven in Rhodesian and South African mine warfare through the 1970s and 1980s, had produced a generation of vehicles. The Caspier had demonstrated the concept at scale. By the mid-1990s, South African engineers at a company called Rumec OMC, later absorbed into BAE Systems Land Systems South Africa, were refining that proven geometry into a smaller, more tactically flexible vehicle suited to the patrol and reconnaissance role rather than the larger troop-carrying role the Caspier filled. The RG-31 emerged from this refinement process in 1996. It used a V-shaped monocoque hull derived directly from the accumulated South African mine protection data, mounted on a chassis based on the Mamba, itself a Caspier lineage vehicle. The RG-31 was smaller than the Caspier, carrying 10 personnel rather than 12, but it incorporated 2 decades of accumulated knowledge about exactly how V-hull geometry needed to be shaped, exactly what ground clearance was required, and exactly how the crew compartment needed to be isolated from the blast to maximize survival probability. Combat weight was approximately 7,200 kilograms in the base configuration, rising to over 9,000 kilograms in up-armored variants. Power came from a Mercedes-Benz or Cummins diesel, depending on variant, producing between 215 and 235 horsepower. The vehicle could travel at up to 100 kilometers per hour and had a range exceeding 700 kilometers. The hull provided protection against 7.62mm armor-piercing rounds, and the V-shaped underbody was rated to defeat anti-tank mines containing up to 7 kilograms of TNT equivalent, a specification derived directly from decades of testing against the TM-46 and similar Soviet-pattern mines that had driven the entire South African mine protection research program. South Africa's first export customers for the RG-31 were exactly the nations you would expect from a vehicle with this pedigree. The United Nations purchased RG-31s for peacekeeping operations in mine-contaminated regions across Africa. The vehicle's reputation in UN service was excellent. Then came a development that would define the RG-31's place in military history. The United States Marine Corps, and later the United States Army, facing escalating IED casualties in Iraq from 2003 onward, began searching urgently for mine-protected vehicles that could be fielded faster than any American design could be developed from scratch. The RG-31 was already in production. It was already combat-tested. It already had a manufacturing relationship with American defense contractor BAE Systems, which had acquired the South African design and manufacturing rights. The path to American procurement was faster than developing a new vehicle domestically. The U.S. military's first major RG-31 purchases began in 2005, initially for explosive ordnance disposal teams who needed maximum protection while operating closest to the threat. The vehicles performed so well in this specialized role that procurement expanded rapidly. When the MRAP program formally launched in 2007, the RG-31 was already a proven quantity, and BAE Systems' American South African manufacturing arrangement allowed production to scale faster than competing designs still working through development and testing. By the end of the MRAP program, the United States had procured more than 2,000 RG-31 Nyala vehicles, alongside similar numbers of the larger Cougar-based Max Pro and Buffalo variants. The RG-31 became the primary mine-protected vehicle for American explosive ordnance disposal units, military police, and numerous infantry and combat engineer formations operating in the most heavily mined regions of Afghanistan. American soldiers who had never heard the word Rhodesia or studied the history of Southern African mine warfare were riding daily in vehicles whose fundamental design philosophy had been proven in the bush wars of a previous generation, refined through thousands of recorded mine strikes that American engineers could study as a complete dataset, rather than having to generate through their own combat losses. The combat record in American service was extensive. RG-31s in Afghanistan survived hundreds of documented IED strikes. The specific geometry that had been refined through South African testing against TM-46 mines proved equally effective against the pressure plate and command-detonated improvised devices that Taliban forces deployed across Helmand, Kandahar, and Uruzgan provinces. American after-action reports, when declassified portions became available, consistently noted occupant survival rates in RG-31 mine strikes that matched or exceeded those of larger and more expensive American-designed MRAP variants, despite the RG-31 being smaller, lighter, and significantly less expensive per unit. One specific advantage became apparent through operational use. The RG-31's smaller size and lighter weight, while offering somewhat reduced protection against the largest improvised devices compared to vehicles like the Buffalo, gave it superior mobility on the narrow roads, irrigation canal crossings, and village tracks that characterize rural Afghan terrain. Larger MRAP variants frequently could not negotiate routes that the RG-31 handled without difficulty. In a war where route flexibility often determined whether a patrol could avoid a known IED threat by taking an alternate path, the RG-31's mobility advantage translated directly into additional protection through avoidance rather than survival alone. Canadian forces in Afghanistan independently reached the same conclusion South Africa had reached decades earlier and the United States would later confirm. Canada operated RG-31s extensively in Kandahar province from 2006 onward, finding the vehicle's combination of protection and mobility ideally suited to the demanding terrain and intense IED threat of that specific operational area. Canadian RG-31s, like their American counterparts, recorded survival rates against mine strikes that validated the original South African engineering data, collected through circumstances the Canadian and American militaries fortunately never had to recreate through their own decade of accumulated combat losses. The RG-31's success in American and Canadian service created an unusual historical irony. South Africa, a nation that had spent the late 20th century under international arms embargo and diplomatic isolation specifically because of its government's policies, had developed military technology so fundamentally sound that the same Western nations that had embargoed it decades earlier became among its largest customers once the technology proved its worth in combat. The engineering had no political affiliation. The V-hull geometry that protected South African police officers along the Namibian border in 1985 protected American soldiers along the Helmand River in 2010 using the same physics, refined through the same accumulated data, manufactured by descendants of the same engineering teams. By 2012, as American forces began drawing down from Afghanistan, the RG-31 fleet represented one of the most successful elements of the entire MRAP program from a cost-effectiveness perspective. The vehicles had been acquired faster than any comparable American design could have been developed, fielded at lower cost than larger MRAP variants, and had compiled a survival record that justified every aspect of the original South African design philosophy. Surplus RG-31s from American and Canadian inventories were subsequently transferred to allied nations and law enforcement agencies, extending the vehicle's operational life well beyond the conflicts that had driven its mass procurement. The RG-31 Nyala represents something distinct from the other vehicles in this series. It is not a vehicle whose creator nation used it directly in a war that defined its reputation. It is a vehicle whose reputation was built almost entirely in the service of nations that did not design it, fighting wars its original engineers never anticipated, validating South African mine protection research through hundreds of incidents in a country 8,000 kilometers from where that research began. The Bushmaster carries the Casper's geometry into Ukraine. The Max Pro carries it into the American MRAP fleet. But the RG-31 carries it most directly, a vehicle built by the direct corporate and engineering descendants of the teams that solved the V-hull problem in the 1970s, purchased by the world's most powerful military specifically because that military recognized it could not develop anything better in the time available, and operated by American and Canadian soldiers who will mostly never know that the vehicle keeping them alive traces its lineage to a war fought under a flag that no longer exists, on a continent 8,000 kilometers from where they were fighting, solving a problem that South African engineers had already solved before most of those soldiers were born.